The year was 1887, and the quiet farming town of Villisca, Iowa, seemed like the kind of place where life followed a gentle rhythm. Families gathered at the church, children played on dirt roads, and neighbors left their doors unlocked at night. But beneath this sense of safety, darkness was waiting. One night, a family's home became the stage for one of the most gruesome crimes in American history, a case so brutal and so mysterious that more than a century later it still casts a shadow over the town. Who could commit such an act? And why would they target a seemingly ordinary family? Tonight, we step back in time to uncover the chilling story that has haunted generations. Before we begin this journey into the past, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by chilling true crime stories that still echo through history, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this again. The town of Villisca, Iowa, in the late 19th century, was a picture of rural America, a small settlement tucked into the rolling farmland of the Midwest. Its streets were unpaved, lined with wooden storefronts that sold everything from dry goods to farm equipment, and its community was tightly woven, where everyone knew one another by name. The rhythm of life here was measured by the seasons: planting in spring, hard labor in summer, harvest in autumn, and the long winters where families gathered around hearth fires. Villisca was not a wealthy town, but it was stable, and for its residents that stability was worth everything. Churches were the backbone of social life, with Sunday services serving as both religious devotion and a place for neighbors to exchange news. Children roamed the fields and creeks barefoot in the warmer months, and families gathered for simple pleasures, such as picnics, fairs, and the occasional social gathering at someone's home. Among those who lived in Villisca were the Moore family, well regarded in the community and seen as upstanding citizens. Josiah Moore, the patriarch, was a respected businessman who worked at a local hardware store before opening his own successful business. His wife, Sarah, was equally respected, known for her devotion to her children and her active role in the church. Together they built a household that many admired, close-knit, hard-working, and deeply involved in the life of their town. Their children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were seen almost daily in town, whether walking to school or helping their parents with small chores. The Moore family embodied the values of Villisca, representing what many in the community considered the ideal American household of the era. But even in a town that prided itself on familiarity and trust, shadows crept at the edges. The railroad brought outsiders, drifters, and salesmen, strangers who came and went with no ties to the community. Rumors occasionally spread about thefts or odd characters passing through, but such worries were often dismissed by townsfolk eager to hold on to their sense of safety. Yet beneath the surface there were tensions, small disputes between neighbors, whispers of rivalries, and the silent struggles of families dealing with financial burdens. Villisca, like any community, was not free from conflict, though most kept their troubles behind closed doors. What made the Moores' story so tragic was not just the violence that befell them, but how utterly unprepared the town was to face something of that magnitude. In an age when people relied more on trust than on locks and more on community reputation than on suspicion, the idea that such horror could occur in the very heart of Villisca was unthinkable. And yet it did. As the summer of 1912 approached, life seemed normal, with families preparing for warmer days, church gatherings, and the small town events that broke the monotony of farm work. On the surface, everything looked serene, but soon, that calm would shatter, and the Moores, along with two visiting children, would become the center of a nightmare that no one in Villisca would ever forget. The story that began in this seemingly ordinary town would travel far beyond its borders, etched into the annals of true crime history. And it is here, in these quiet streets and modest homes, that we must begin our journey. For to understand the crime, we must first understand the world it destroyed. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the Moore household was alive with the sounds of children's laughter and the gentle murmur of conversation. Earlier that day, Sarah Moore had helped organize a Children's Day service at the local Presbyterian church, an event filled with hymns, recitations, and the bright energy of youth. It was a source of pride for her, and Josiah, ever the supportive husband, was by her side as the children performed. Among the attendees were Lena and Ina Stillinger, two sisters from a nearby town who had asked their parents if they might spend the night with the Moores after the service. An innocent request that would prove fateful. As dusk fell, the group made their way back to the Moore residence, a modest but comfortable two-story home. The children chattered as they readied for bed, their voices carrying through the wooden walls as lantern light flickered against the darkening windows. By all accounts, it was an ordinary night, one no different from the countless others that had passed peacefully before it. But in the deep hours that followed, something unspeakable occurred. Sometime after midnight, while the small town of Villisca lay quiet under a canopy of stars, an intruder entered the Moore home. Investigators later speculated that the killer had hidden in the attic, lying in wait until the household had gone to sleep, listening to the last whispers of laughter fade into silence. When the moment came, the figure descended into the slumbering house armed with an axe. The first blows were delivered to Josiah and Sarah as they slept in their bed, swift and brutal, silencing them before they had the chance to stir. The sound of the weapon striking wood and bone echoed faintly through the rooms, yet none of the children awoke in time to escape. The killer moved methodically from room to room, extinguishing the fragile lives of the Moore children before turning his attention to the Stillinger girls, who had been offered nothing more than a night of friendship and hospitality. Evidence later suggested that Lena may have awakened in those terrible moments, perhaps glimpsing her attacker in the faint moonlight that filtered through the curtains, but she too was overcome. The violence was relentless, the weapon swinging with a force that seemed driven not by necessity but by rage, leaving behind a scene so horrifying that seasoned investigators would later struggle to describe it. What made the crime even more chilling was the strange, almost ritualistic behavior of the killer afterward. Mirrors throughout the home were covered with cloth, as though the murderer could not bear to see his own reflection. Windows were draped, food was left uneaten on a table, and pieces of clothing were used to cover the victims' faces. In a time when fingerprinting was still in its infancy and forensic science was limited, such details left the authorities baffled. The crime had not been committed in haste. It had been carried out with a disturbing patience, leaving behind not only bodies but symbols, traces of a mind consumed by something far darker than simple malice. When morning came, the house stood in eerie silence, its occupants still and cold, while the rest of Villisca stirred to life as if nothing had changed. Neighbors went about their chores, children played in the streets, and shopkeepers opened their doors unaware that within the Moore home, an atrocity had unfolded that would shatter their trust in the safety of their community. The discovery, when it came, would send shockwaves through the town, but in those first hours after the crime, the killer's presence lingered invisibly, like a shadow retreating into the countryside, leaving behind a house that would forever be remembered not as a home, but as the site of one of America's most infamous unsolved murders. The morning of June 10, 1912 began like any other in Villisca, but it would soon collapse into chaos as neighbors realized something was terribly wrong at the Moore residence. When the household remained unusually quiet and the curtains stayed drawn, a concerned neighbor approached the home, only to find doors locked and silence unnervingly complete. A call was placed to Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who arrived with a spare key. The moment he opened the door and stepped inside, the smell of death was unmistakable, heavy and suffocating in the still summer air. His discovery of the bodies, lifeless and disfigured, would mark the beginning of one of the most perplexing investigations in American history. Word spread quickly through the small community, and within hours the Moore home was crowded with horrified townspeople, many entering before law enforcement could secure the scene. This early contamination would prove disastrous as fingerprints were smudged, footprints trampled, and potential clues lost to morbid curiosity. When authorities did arrive, their methods reflected the limitations of early 20th century forensics. Fingerprinting was barely understood. Blood pattern analysis did not exist, and the ability to link physical evidence conclusively to a suspect was nearly impossible. Instead, investigators relied on intuition, gossip, and the tenuous threads of circumstantial evidence. The brutality of the murders suggested a killer driven by personal rage or twisted compulsion, yet no clear motive emerged. Robbery was quickly dismissed, the home was untouched, valuables still in place. Revenge was considered, but the Moores were a respected family without enemies known to harbor such venom. That left investigators searching for an unknown monster who had moved like a phantom through the quiet streets of Villisca. In the weeks that followed, suspicion fell upon a handful of figures, each more curious than the last. One of the earliest was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a troubled reputation. Kelly had attended the Children's Day service organized by Sarah Moore and was seen leaving town by train early the following morning. His eccentric behavior, obsession with young girls, and erratic personality quickly drew attention. When he later wrote bizarre letters to investigators and even confessed to the murders, before recanting, he became the prime suspect. Yet despite 2 trials, Kelly was ultimately acquitted, his confession dismissed as the ramblings of an unstable mind. Another line of inquiry pointed toward Frank Jones, a wealthy local businessman and Iowa state senator, who had once employed Josiah Moore. The 2 men had fallen out bitterly, with rumors suggesting Josiah had grown too close to Jones's daughter-in-law. Could the crime have been an act of vengeance ordered by a powerful man with connections deep into the state's politics? Though the whispers persisted for years, no evidence strong enough to implicate Jones was ever uncovered. More chilling still were reports of similar axe murders occurring across the Midwest during that same era, including in Kansas, Colorado, and Illinois. Some criminologists have speculated that the Villisca crime may have been the work of a transient serial killer who traveled by train, striking towns with horrifying precision before vanishing into the night. This theory gained traction as parallels emerged. Families slaughtered in their beds, windows covered, food untouched, and the same eerie calm left in the wake of devastation. Yet with each new lead came more frustration, and as weeks turned into months, the trail grew cold. Despite interrogations, rumors, and sensational headlines, no one was ever convicted, leaving the case suspended in a fog of uncertainty. The image of that quiet house on a summer night, its windows shrouded, its occupants silenced, remained an unsolved riddle that mocked the investigative powers of its time. To the people of Villisca, it was not simply a murder investigation. It was the shattering of innocence, proof that evil could walk unrecognized among them and slip away into the darkness, leaving only questions that seemed destined never to be answered. The aftermath of the Villisca Axe Murders was as haunting as the crime itself, for it was not only the Moore family and the Stillinger girls who had been extinguished that night, but also the sense of safety and stability that once defined the small Iowa town. In the days following the discovery, Villisca became a place transformed by grief and suspicion. The funerals, attended by thousands, were solemn affairs where hymns carried on the summer air could not mask the sound of mothers weeping and children whispering in fear. Black wreaths hung from doorways, and the once friendly exchanges on the streets turned guarded, as neighbors eyed one another with unease. For if a crime so monstrous could be committed under the cover of night in the heart of their own town, then who among them might harbor such darkness? Families locked their doors for the first time, and the innocence of leaving windows open to catch the evening breeze became a memory of the past. The press descended upon Villisca in waves, reporters scribbling lurid headlines and speculating wildly on motives and suspects. Some claimed it was the work of a madman, others whispered of secret affairs, and still more pushed the theory of a wandering serial killer leaving trails of blood along the railroad lines of America's Midwest. National newspapers painted Villisca not as a sleepy farming community, but as the setting for an unsolvable American tragedy, a modern ghost story that resonated far beyond Iowa's borders. For the families left behind, grief turned inward. Ross Moore carried the memory of discovering the bodies for the rest of his life, haunted by the scene that greeted him when he unlocked his brother's door. The Stillinger family, robbed of their daughters Lena and Ina, bore a wound that time could not heal, their pain compounded by the cruel twist of fate that had placed the girls in that house on that night. Even decades later, survivors would speak of the lingering fear that settled over Villisca, a shadow that darkened their childhoods and followed them into adulthood. The failure to solve the case left wounds deeper still. Each passing year without justice eroded faith in the institutions meant to protect them, and whispers of corruption and incompetence tainted the reputations of lawmen and politicians alike. Reverend Kelly's acquittal only deepened the unease, leaving townspeople divided, some convinced of his guilt, others certain the real killer had slipped through the cracks. Rumors surrounding Frank Jones, with his political power and supposed vendetta, only fueled suspicions that truth had been deliberately buried. Theories multiplied as the years stretched on, but none brought closure. The legacy of the crime was not confined to Villisca alone. It became a case studied by criminologists, historians, and amateur sleuths alike, a puzzle that highlighted the fragility of early 20th century policing and the profound impact of unsolved crimes on collective memory. The Moore home itself became an object of both horror and fascination. For decades, it stood as a grim reminder of that June night, passed down from owner to owner, until eventually restored to its early appearance and opened for tours. Visitors spoke of an unshakable heaviness within its walls, of footsteps in empty halls, of a silence that felt alive. For some, it became a symbol of respect for the lives lost, for others an eerie attraction to the macabre. Yet beneath the ghost stories and whispered legends, the reality remained. 8 lives had been brutally ended, their futures stolen, their names forever tied to the darkness that descended upon Villisca. The town itself would never truly recover, and the murders came to define its history in a way that eclipsed all else. Even a century later, when the world had long since moved forward, the question still hung heavy in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Who killed the Moores and the Stillinger girls, and why? That uncertainty became the most enduring legacy of all, leaving Villisca not only with tragedy, but with a mystery that refuses to fade. The story of the Villisca Axe Murders endures not simply because of its brutality, but because of its silence, an absence of resolution that lingers like a phantom in the collective memory of America's heartland. More than a century has passed since the night the Moores and Stillinger girls lost their lives, and yet the case remains unsolved, the answers buried with time, perhaps never to be unearthed. For the families who once walked those creaking floorboards, for the children who grew up under the shadow of whispered theories, and for the generations who followed, Villisca became more than a town. It became a question mark, a reminder of how fragile justice can be and how easily certainty slips away. The story invites us to look not only at the crime itself, but at the society that surrounded it. The early 20th century was a time of transition in America, when modern investigative science had not yet taken hold, and small-town policing relied more on intuition than on evidence. In that gap between old-world instinct and the coming age of forensic rigor, the Villisca killer found space to act and then to vanish, leaving nothing but grief and speculation behind. What followed was a kind of collective scar, a wound that reshaped how people lived their daily lives. Where once doors had been left unlocked, they were now bolted shut. Where once neighbors trusted one another without question, suspicion took root and spread like a vine through the community. Innocence once lost could never be regained, and Villisca's children grew up in a world where bedtime no longer promised safety. Yet the murders also became something more than a local tragedy. They grew into a cultural story retold across the Midwest and beyond, a dark parable about trust, vulnerability, and the faceless nature of evil. Each new generation encountered the tale, whether through hushed family stories, newspaper archives, or eventually the growing industry of books, documentaries, and ghost tours that turned Villisca into both a place of mourning and a destination for the morbidly curious. In this transformation, the crime took on layers of meaning. Some sought to honor the dead, others to solve the riddle, and still others to feel the chill of standing where horror had once unfolded. But at its heart, the story resists any simple interpretation. Was it a crime of passion fueled by jealousy and resentment? Was it the act of a deranged wanderer who struck once and disappeared forever into the sprawl of America? Or was it, as some believed, the work of a man within the community itself, shielded by silence and protected by circumstance? The truth, locked away by time, may never reveal itself, and perhaps that is why Villisca holds us still. Unsolved murders occupy a particular place in human imagination. They deny us closure, they unsettle our belief in the balance of justice, and they remind us of our own vulnerability. To tell the story of Villisca is not to simply recount a crime. It is to step into the space left by unanswered questions and to feel the weight of lives interrupted. Josiah and Sarah Moore, their children, and the Stillinger sisters were more than names in a police file. They were part of a living community, part of families who loved them, part of futures that were stolen in a single night of violence. To remember them is to strip away the spectacle and the myth, to return to the raw human cost at the center of it all. As the century mark has passed, the house still stands, preserved with care, a silent witness to the horror it once contained. Visitors speak of the stillness that seems to cling to its walls, of the heavy air that refuses to dissipate, and of a sense that the story itself is alive within those rooms. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, The Villisca Axe Murders remain a haunting not only of a house but of a people and of a history, and so we end where the story began. In a quiet Iowa town that once knew only peace until one summer night changed it forever. Villisca teaches us that evil can strike anywhere, that it can hide behind familiar faces or emerge from the darkness without warning, and that sometimes the most chilling legacy of all is not what we know, but what we never will.